Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission for this session is to impartially map out this really ambitious piece of theological architecture.
Yeah, ambitious is definitely the right word for it.
Right. So we are examining the transcript of a YouTube video titled "The Great Exchange." This was a sermon delivered by Pastor Stephen Wilhoit at Dwell City Church, and that was back on April 5, 2026.
Exactly. And what we want to do here is explore how this text takes a very specific historical encounter.
Yeah.
The trial of Jesus of Nazareth under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate.
And it layers it with all this ancient biblical symbolism, right?
Right. The goal of the speaker is to basically explain one of the most central and honestly most complex doctrines of the Christian faith.
Substitutionary atonement.
Yes. It's a text that really requires us to look at both macro-level ancient rituals and then these super micro-level dialogues.
Yeah, it's like the speaker is trying to weave centuries of these completely disparate religious traditions into a single Friday morning in first century Jerusalem.
Which is quite the undertaking.
It really is. So to hook us into that concept, the sermon opens with a really grounded analogy, and I kind of want to frame our entire deep dive for you, the listener, around this idea.
Oh, the currency analogy. I love this.
Yeah, it's so good. Imagine you have traveled somewhere far away. Maybe you are in like a remote village or a bustling foreign market somewhere.
I can picture that.
And you realize you have entirely the wrong currency in your wallet. You have a pocket full of your home country's cash, but over there, it is completely useless.
You can't even buy a bottle of water.
Exactly. You cannot get a room for the night. You are holding what feels like wealth, but in this new kingdom, it holds absolutely zero value.
You're just stuck.
Right.
Ugh.
You are essentially stuck until you can find a very specific person at an exchange counter, someone who is qualified to take your unusable currency and swap it out for the currency of that actual land.
And the speaker uses that feeling of absolute helplessness as the foundation for his entire argument. Wilhoit basically argues that humanity is clutching this spiritual currency that holds no purchasing power in the kingdom of God.
And that currency is defined in the text as sin, guilt, and rebellion.
Right. Left to our own devices, that money buys nothing but death. So a transaction has to occur. The text posits that Jesus acts as this ultimate exchange counter.
Taking the bad money.
Taking the unusable currency of human guilt and swapping it for his own currency of perfect righteousness, which is what allows people to actually enter this spiritual kingdom.
It's a powerful image, and I want to look at how the source material illustrates this great exchange because it avoids staying in the realm of like abstract theology.
It really grounds it.
Yeah, it grounds the mechanism of this swap in a very tense, physical, historical moment. So we have to start at the standoff at Pilate's doorstep.
Right. To understand how this exchange practically unfolds, you really need to grasp the logistics of what is happening in Jerusalem right then. The city is celebrating Passover week.
And the sheer scale of that event is totally critical to the narrative, right?
Oh, absolutely. The normal population of Jerusalem at the time was roughly 60,000 people. But during Passover, that number exploded to over 1 million.
Wow, over 1 million. Just packed into that ancient city.
Yes. Pilgrims were just pouring in from all over the known world. The city would have been this chaotic, claustrophobic sensory overload. And because of that massive influx, Roman security was at its absolute highest.
They must have been on edge.
For sure. The occupying forces knew that any small spark could ignite a massive nationalist riot.
Which honestly explains the sheer overkill of the arrest. Because the text notes that in the middle of the night, an escort of 600 soldiers comes to arrest Jesus.
Yeah, 600.
600 heavily armed Roman soldiers for one unarmed rabbi hanging out in a garden.
They are terrified of a mob uprising. So after the arrest, the authorities bounce him around to various religious leaders in the middle of the night.
Like a secret tribunal.
Exactly. And finally, as the sun is coming up and the city is waking to 1 million pilgrims, they march him to the headquarters of Pilate, the Roman governor.
And the architectural layout of this specific moment is where the text introduces a striking, almost dark irony.
The pavement scene.
Yeah, the Jewish religious leaders who actively want Jesus executed, they bring him to Pilate's headquarters, but they flat out refuse to step foot inside the building.
They stay out on the pavement.
Right. And the reason given is that entering a Gentile building, the home of a non-Jew, would make them ritually unclean according to Jewish law.
Because if they become unclean, They are disqualified from eating the Passover meal that evening.
Which is wild. Can you unpack the mechanism of ritual impurity for us?
Yeah, so in the ancient Near East, it wasn't just about physical dirt, it was about spiritual contamination. A Roman governor's headquarters would likely contain leavened bread or items dedicated to pagan gods. And coming into contact with those things meant you absorbed their defilement. You were cut off from the holy community until you underwent a whole purification process.
Think about the paradox there for a second. These religious leaders are meticulously analyzing the microscopic details of ritual purity, like dodging a Roman floor tile so they can eat a holy meal.
While simultaneously conspiring to execute a man.
Yes, pushing a lethal verdict through a corrupt legal system. They are ignoring a literal murder plot to maintain a dietary requirement.
It's intense. And Wilhoit uses this physical divide, the religious leader standing outside, Jesus standing inside, as the profound theological symbol kicking off the great exchange.
It's like the physical starting point of the swap.
Exactly. Jesus steps into the unclean space, and the sermon makes a point to emphasize that he is not dragged into this defilement against his will.
Right, because the text references a moment in the Garden of Gethsemane just hours earlier. Jesus spoke a single phrase, and all 600 of those soldiers physically fell to the ground.
He floored an entire battalion with his voice.
The implication being, if he is walking into Pilate's headquarters, he's doing it intentionally.
Yes, he willingly crosses the threshold into the defiled space. The religious leaders are desperately trying to stay clean by remaining outside, completely missing the sermon's central claim.
Which is?
That the man stepping inside is preparing to absorb their uncleanness so they can actually be made pure. The geography of the trial is constructed to mirror the theology of the exchange. Jesus goes into the dirt so the people can stand in the claim.
Wow. Okay, so while that geographic irony is playing out on the street, the speaker pulls the lens back to connect Jesus to the specific ancient festivals that those million pilgrims are in town to celebrate.
Right.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, because the text makes a massive architectural leap.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, it starts with the Passover lamb, which makes sense, it's Passover, but then it immediately brings in the Day of Atonement, which features a scapegoat.
Yeah.
But the Day of Atonement happens in the fall, like 6 months later. Is the sermon just committing theological gerrymandering here? Mixing and matching whatever holidays fit the narrative?
It's a fair question. But the sermon justifies converging these two distinct holidays by arguing that God designed both rituals to point to the same ultimate mechanism of justice.
Oh, okay, how so?
Let's look at how the text breaks them down, starting with the Passover lamb. This commemorates the Exodus in Egypt, where the Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and paint its blood on their doorposts.
Right, the narrative there being that an angel of death passed through the land, but when it saw the blood, it would literally pass over that house.
Exactly. The blood functioned as a substitute. In the ancient world, justice required a physical cost. The lamb's blood acted as a covering, proving that a death had already occurred in that household, sparing the family inside from judgment.
So Wilhoit identifies Jesus as the ultimate Passover lamb.
Yes, designated to be sacrificed to cover the sins of humanity. But a covering is only half the equation, which brings us to the Day of Atonement.
The holiday with the 2 goats.
Right. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take 2 goats. The first is sacrificed to satisfy the judgment against the people's rebellion. But the second goat has a completely different function.
The scapegoat.
Exactly. The high priest physically lays his hands on the head of this second animal, symbolically transferring all the guilt, shame, and sin of the entire nation onto it. This is the scapegoat.
It almost sounds like an ancient hazmat protocol.
A hazmat protocol. I like that.
Yeah, like when there is a catastrophic toxic spill, you don't just mop it up and leave the rags sitting in the living room.
No, you definitely don't.
You have to physically remove the hazardous material, seal it, and transport it completely outside the population zone. The scapegoat is basically the ancient hazmat vehicle for human guilt.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. Because once the sins are imparted to it, the scapegoat is not sacrificed on an altar. It is driven out of the temple, out of the camp, and sent away into the wilderness to die.
It carries the toxic contamination of the people outside the city.
Outside, yes. And connecting those two holidays gives us the how behind the physical location of the crucifixion.
Right, because Jesus is not executed in the center of Jerusalem.
No, he isn't. He isn't killed in the temple courtyard. He is ultimately sent to a hill called Golgotha, which is situated strictly outside the city walls.
So he is marched out of the gates mirroring the exact path of the scapegoat.
Yes, the sermon builds the case that Jesus isn't just the lamb whose blood covers the people. He is simultaneously the scapegoat, bearing the uncleanness outside the camp.
The historical geography aligns perfectly with the ancient liturgical requirements.
It really does. It is an incredibly intricate architectural claim.
Yeah, the text is attempting to resolve centuries of disparate Jewish rituals in one physical body on a single morning.
Mhm.
But while all this sweeping historical theology is lining up outside, there's an intensely personal and philosophical interrogation happening privately inside the headquarters.
Right. Pilate is looking at the man the crowd wants dead.
And Pilate is a pragmatic Roman politician. He doesn't care about Jewish purity laws or ancient festivals.
Not at all. He cares about keeping the peace during a massive tourist surge. So he asks Jesus a direct political question. Are you the king of the Jews?
And Jesus completely flips the script on him. Instead of giving a straight answer, he responds with a question. Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?
It is a brilliant rhetorical defense. Jesus is challenging the very foundation of Pilate's inquiry. He is asking whether Pilate is genuinely seeking to understand reality for himself, or if he's simply echoing the accusations of the angry mob outside his window.
And to make sense of what Jesus is demanding of Pilate here, Wilhoit introduces a really helpful analogy about a chair.
Oh, right. The chair analogy.
Yeah. You can know every objective fact about a chair. You can measure the legs. You can observe that it has a sturdy back and a solid seat.
You can read the manufacturing specifications.
Exactly, and logically conclude that the chair is fully capable of holding a human being. But the argument is that you aren't actually trusting the chair until you take your feet off the floor and put your entire weight into it.
The text uses that to draw a sharp distinction between historical knowledge and active faith. Pilate has the facts, he hears the claims, but Jesus is pressing him on whether he has any personal skin in the game.
And Jesus clarifies that his kingdom is not of this world.
Right, because if it were a physical earthly kingdom, his followers would be outside staging an armed rebellion to rescue him.
Which they aren't doing. The text makes it clear his followers have scattered.
Exactly. Jesus describes a spiritual kingdom. And because it is spiritual, it bypasses normal physical and ethnic boundaries. It is accessible to Romans, Greeks, the enslaved, the free.
You aren't born into it through genetics.
No, you must be spiritually transformed to enter it. And Pilate, hearing all this talk about a kingdom of truth from a battered prisoner, responds with one of the most famous cynical dismissals in history. What is truth?
It is the ultimate eye roll from a weary bureaucrat.
It really is.
But Wilhoit's analysis of why Pilate misses the mark is fascinating. Pilate assumes truth is a concept, right? Like a philosophy, a set of facts to be debated in a university or a courtroom.
But earlier in the source texts, Jesus claimed, I am the truth.
Right. The sermon argues that truth is not a what, it is a who. Truth is embodied in a person.
And Pilate is standing inches away from the very thing he is inquiring about, yet he is completely blind to it.
So how does the sermon explain that blindness?
Well, to explain the mechanism behind this blindness, the speaker pulls from the ancient prophet Ezekiel, specifically chapter 36. In that text, God promises to give people a new heart, to replace their heart of stone with a heart of flesh, and to put a new spirit within them.
Okay, let me stop you there, because the implications of that are heavy.
Oh, they definitely are.
Jesus tells Pilate, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. The order of operations seems to dictate that you don't just hear the truth and then decide to belong to it. You have to be of the truth first.
Right.
So if Pilate currently has a heart of stone and he needs God to magically give him a heart of flesh to understand anything, how is it Pilate's fault that he can't hear the truth? It sounds incredibly deterministic. Like Pilate is essentially a victim of his own biology.
The sermon wrestles with that exact tension. The text's internal logic asserts that humanity's heart of stone is a willful suppression of the truth, not just a passive disability.
Okay, a willful suppression.
Yes. The human condition is inherently resistant to the spiritual kingdom. Therefore, spiritual transformation, receiving that heart of flesh, is a prerequisite to possessing the capacity to recognize the voice of the shepherd.
So Pilate is operating with a heart of stone, entirely focused on earthly power and self-preservation.
Exactly. Because he lacks that internal transformation, the words of Jesus sound like meaningless static. He is deaf to the truth standing right in front of him.
So Pilate gives up on the philosophical debate entirely. He turns his back on the concept of truth, walks back outside onto the pavement, and delivers a legal verdict that essentially finalizes the physical great exchange.
Right. Pilate stands before the religious leaders and delivers his official binding declaration regarding Jesus. I find no guilt in him.
And from a purely legal standpoint, that should be the end of the proceeding. The highest authority in the region says not guilty, you let the prisoner go.
But Pilate has a PR strategy to manage.
Right. The optics.
To keep the peace and demonstrate goodwill during the festival, it was a Roman custom to release one prisoner of the crowd's choosing. Pilate assumes this is his exit strategy.
Because he just declared Jesus innocent.
Right, so he offers to release him under the Passover custom, thinking the crowd will accept the compromise. Instead, the crowd violently rejects the offer. They demand the release of a man named Barabbas.
And this is a detail we really need to look at closely, because in the grand scheme of Roman history, Barabbas is a total nobody. He is a minor footnote.
Yeah, absolutely.
The text specifies he was a robber and an insurrectionist. He was a genuinely guilty man who actively participated in the violence the Romans were so terrified of. So why is the release of this specific, forgotten criminal the linchpin of this entire sermon?
Well, Wilhoit uses Barabbas as the theological punchline of the narrative. First, look at Pilate's verdict. I find no guilt in him.
Right.
The speaker argues this official declaration of innocence fulfills the Old Testament requirements. It points back to Isaiah 53, which prophesied a suffering servant who had done no violence and had no deceit in his mouth.
Okay, I see the connection.
And it also fulfills the Exodus requirement that the sacrificial Passover lamb must be completely unblemished and without fault.
The perfect, unblemished currency has been verified by the state. It is ready for the exchange counter.
Exactly. And Barabbas represents the unusable currency. The argument presented is that Barabbas is not just historical collateral damage. He is the literal physical stand-in for the listener.
So we are Barabbas in this analogy.
Yes. Think about the psychology of the crowd. Usually during this custom, a crowd would demand the release of an upstanding citizen unjustly held by the state.
Someone innocent.
Right. But by choosing Barabbas, a man definitively and violently guilty, a literal exchange takes place on the pavement.
The guilty man walks completely free. He gets his life back. He gets to walk away from the cross that the Romans had literally built for him.
And he only walks free because the innocent, perfect man physically takes his place.
Let's look at the mechanism of substitution here. Barabbas doesn't earn his freedom.
No.
He doesn't negotiate a plea deal. He doesn't go through a rehabilitation program to become a better person to deserve it. He is simply swapped out.
Wilhoit frames this as the living diorama of the spiritual transaction.
Yes. The sermon drives home the point that every human being is in the position of Barabbas. Humanity has rebelled. Humanity is holding the unusable currency of guilt.
And the great exchange is that Jesus steps into that exact place, takes the execution earned by the rebel, and hands over the freedom and righteousness he earned. It is a sweeping conclusion. The architecture of the argument takes the macro history of ancient Jewish festivals and zeroes in on the exact legal status of a forgotten Roman prisoner to make its point.
To summarize this deep dive into Wilhoit's text, left to ourselves, the spiritual currency we hold only buys death.
Right.
But Jesus intentionally steps into the unclean space of the governor's headquarters. He acts simultaneously as the Passover lamb whose sacrifice covers judgment and the hazmat scapegoat who carries the uncleanness outside the city walls.
He's the innocent man who swaps places with the guilty Barabbas.
Exactly. Now the sermon concludes by pointing to the event celebrated 3 days later, the resurrection. Wilhoit argues that the resurrection is essentially the receipt of the transaction.
Because if Jesus had stayed dead, the debt would still be outstanding. The argument is that his rising from the grave proves the currency exchange was accepted by God, the payment was deemed sufficient, justice was fully satisfied, and the power of sin was permanently broken.
As a reminder to you listening, our goal today was to impartially map out the theological framework presented in this specific text. We wanted to analyze how this speaker weaves together historical geography, Roman political customs, and layers of biblical symbols to formulate the core Christian belief of substitutionary atonement.
And it really demonstrates how a theological framework relies heavily on understanding the intricate mechanisms of ancient cultural and legal systems.
It is a complex piece of architecture for sure. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over something that builds on that quiet, intense standoff between Jesus and Pilate.
Oh, the interrogation inside.
Yeah. The sermon suggests something incredibly provocative, that truth is a person rather than just a set of abstract facts or logical arguments.
Right.
If that premise holds, if truth is something you relate to, a voice you must listen for, rather than just data you memorize or debate, how does that change the way you interact with the world?
It changes everything.
If truth is a person, how might that shift the way you evaluate your own most deeply held beliefs today? Are you just meticulously measuring the facts of the chair, or have you actually trusted it enough to sit down?
That's the real question.
Because at the end of the day, no matter how intimately you understand the exchange rate, it doesn't do you any good until you actually slide your unusable currency across the counter.